non-existent coronavirus in the U.S., but from my experience over the last week or two, most events are pretty sparsely attended. I can only imagine that in future weeks, it'll be hard to say hello to anybody on the street because this kind of panic that's gripping us, which is too bad. But fortunately, we are streaming this event, so we will have those at home who are a little more timorous will still be able to benefit from Robbie Diamond's experience. I don't think that Robbie needs that much of an introduction to this crowd. You know that he's the head of the Securing America's Future Energy Group, and we're very proud to have them as a partner organization of the Daniel Morgan Graduate School. And I would like to point out to Margarita over here, who is an energy fellow, one of our students who's an energy fellow with SAFE. And we're very proud of her and very grateful to Robbie and his team, also here in Abundant Force. I think that we have a lot of potential for further cooperation. So this was just an informal kind of kickoff, if you will. And I don't know if before I start interrogating you, Robbie, you wanted to say a word or two.
First of all, just thank you very much. Thanks to the Daniel Morgan School. It's been a great partnership. I feel like playing a soccer match in an empty stadium, but they're doing it around the world, so why not me? So thanks, and I'm happy to be interrogated any way you like. So let's start where you want to go. I mean, I'm happy to describe the organization, what we're doing, whatever is good for you.
Well, maybe you'd be good enough to start by just telling us a bit about the background of SAFE and your role in it.
Sure. So I'm, some people are Mr. Smith goes to Washington. I guess I'm Mr. Diamond comes to Washington from Toronto, Canada originally. And in 2004, we started SAFE, Securing America's Future Energy. In 2008, we started a different organization called the Diversification Coalition. And really, we have one mission, which is to end oil dependence for economic and national security. Clearly in 2004, the situation was very different, but if you go back then, and we were fighting two wars, hot wars. We've got a global war on terror, and really the debate in energy, from what I saw in Washington, was very similar to the beer debate they used to have. Tastes great, less filling. Like, let's use more, let's just use less. And I was like, why don't we do something about this? And number two is I really saw how the advocates, really, environmentalists, everything was sort of framed in that messaging. And so I was able to start this organization and recruit 4-star admirals and generals who have been, sent around the world over the, I guess since the Carter Doctrine, but probably even before that, when Roosevelt and the King of Saudi Arabia made their first agreements. And, I think they'd had enough, and they were worried about our future and the military decisions we were making, and wanted flexibility. It's not about isolationism, but rather flexibility. And then CEOs of major companies, Fred Smith being our co-chair of this group called the Energy Security Leadership Council, and they're burning like 1.4 billion gallons of fuel a year. They've got over 700 airplanes. They've got 90,000 vehicles. They're the clipper ships of the modern age. And so when you talk about a global mobile economy, oil prices matter, and his experiences matter both. Anyway, so bringing them together and sort of putting out a plan of why this mattered to national and economic security, and then what we should do about it. So that's sort of the history of SAFE, and we stand by it. Although, as I say, the markets have changed, and we'll talk about that and why we still think this is a problem. But also technologies have changed, and I think what's made us really different is, we're not paid to be for one technology, but rather we see what we think is most effective, and then get engaged.
Well, Robbie, I think that you're right, spot on when you're talking about technologies and changing circumstances. Some have described what I guess could be called the North American Renaissance in the energy field that's emerged over the past several years, fracking, et cetera, various means of extraction, which are really dramatically changing the dynamic in terms of our dependency, certainly, and perhaps even ability to supply friends and allies that are otherwise vulnerable to blackmail and manipulation by their energy suppliers. I wonder if you'd care to explain how the last couple of years have really kind of changed the dynamic of that.
So first of all, I'd say that as an organization, we've always been for let's produce what we can domestically with the right environmental standards. Let's use it as efficiently as possible, because every dollar of GDP you can squeeze out of a barrel. You improve your economic prospects, and then finally, let's diversify transportation fuels away from just one fuel source. And I think let's stop a minute on that, because I think that really defines the future, which is 92% of our transportation sector requires oil, and there's really nothing else to do about it. And as the price goes up, we pay, and actually, as we see now with coronavirus, price go down, there's a global price essentially for that. So as long as you are beholden to one fuel source on a global market, that any event can create the volatility,
Yes.
There's a problem. So I think that's really important, and I'll get back to that, and I think a lot of our conversation will continue to revolve around that. But two, look, over the last, I would say there's two inventions, or two great things that have happened since we started in 2004. Actually, there's probably more. But I would just point to two, which is one is Mr. Mitchell and fracking, hydraulic fracking, and just what that has done to the energy landscape. But number two would be my cell phone here, and just watching the battery in my cell phone. And I was just commenting with someone the other day, like I got a new iPhone, and you're so used to looking for a plug in the middle of the day, and suddenly you get this new iPhone, you're like, oh my God, like this is amazing. And I think that the lithium-ion battery and Mr. Mitchell have changed the prospects both for the United States, in the world, and so that's what's exciting. And you throw into that connectivity of cars, autonomy of cars, and other things we'll talk about soon. But in the end, as long as the United States is 92% dependent on transportation fuel, there's a cartel out there that is always manipulating the price. Today, for example, they're announcing another 1.5 million count. They're basically breaking American law, right? If they got in a room, if our companies did that, we wouldn't allow that to happen. And I just think, why would we put our futures on the line of people in other rooms from other countries making decisions? Are we in a much better position? Absolutely. More flexible, more balance of payments are staying in our country, and that's all really exciting. But ultimately, like I said, I come back to this idea that when you produce electricity, you can use coal, natural gas, nuclear, wind, solar, but when you drive your car, fly your airplanes, or drive your trucks, currently we basically are 100% dependent on liquid fuel. And that, I think, continues to be a challenge.
Well, you touched on the transition to autonomous vehicles, and of course, electric vehicles are perhaps increasingly on the horizon, and using lithium batteries, charging stations would, to some extent, wean us off of oil. Would not be the case, and what's the trend there? How soon could we expect that we all be driving electric cars?
Well, based on the announcements from General Motors yesterday, they hope it's tomorrow. But I think it'll take longer than that. Look, I do think first of all, I said, I care about diversity, so whether it be electric or there'll be natural gas or hydrogen, I don't think that's the debate we need to have. But clearly in the light duty sector, and more increasingly in the heavier duty sectors, medium buses, you really do see electric vehicles taking off for a variety of reasons. One reason is China itself. So China clearly sees, we have this oil. They're not producing this oil. We have our ships in the Malacca Straits. These are things that they do not want. They also see an economic opportunity to leapfrog our industry. So they're a massive market and are driving that change. Then there's climate change and other things that are going on. So there's a massive push towards this. But at the same time, as I said, you've got the lithium-ion battery. And someone once said something really amazing about electric vehicles, which I think is very profound at the moment, which is, oil is internal combustion engine cars have a great fuel, but are actually a lousy driving experience. But electric vehicles, if anyone's driven one, hopefully the audience will, when they're out of their quarantine from Corona, have a chance to get in one. They have a great driving experience, but a lousy fuel, and that batteries don't carry as much energy
Right.
as. But the batteries, as I said before, are getting better all the time. And really, where we are today is this transition moment. I think we've got a lot of chokeholds along the way as people change. So, for example, dealers. Where do you buy your car from in the United States? You buy it from a dealer. Well, dealers don't want to sell these cars because, as the president of GM said yesterday, an internal combustion engine in its powertrain is 555 parts. You know how many parts are in their new electric vehicle? 19. So over 60% of a dealer's revenue comes from service. So I have driven an electric car for 10 years, 4 different models, and I have never been to the service once in 10 years. So I think you have these problems of getting over this. So it's not just, it doesn't go as far, there's not the charging. Also, on the charging, how many times have I been to a public station in 10 years? 0. Most of us probably would never need that. So there's a perception problem. Also, look, batteries have been expensive. They're just coming down. So car companies have taken their time. If you're Tesla, that's all you do, and you're getting credits. But I think the major OEMs, are taking their time. So, we're in this moment. I think it's exciting that there's 1.5 million on the road here. There's 2.5 million on the road in China. But every projection from, IEA's projections to EIA's projections to OPEC's own projections are there's going to be hundreds of millions of these, on the road. And I think that's where we need to go and find ways to expedite that, actually.
Well, the picture is looking better and better for the United States, as you suggest. What about some of our friends and allies? It seems that we're running around trying to squelch deals where people become more dependent on Russian oil because the Russians are so dependable as a supplier. Insert more sarcastic lines here. Japan, meanwhile, has this terrible post-3/11 issue with nuclear power. They've been having a debate that continues about what are the next steps. Do they turn to coal? What is their best path forward? How can we, with this increasing energy surplus, step in and make a difference with the friends and allies?
Right. So the first thing I would say is it's important to distinguish between the production of electricity and the production and the use of oil. So the United States, for instance, doesn't really use oil to produce electricity. It's actually oil-free since the 1970s, for the most part. And therefore, other countries, might. So currently, unless you have an electric vehicle, it doesn't matter if you have coal, natural gas, nuclear, right? Because it's not powering your transportation fleet. It's actually that merging of your vehicle plugging it into the grid that changes that dynamic. So, Japan's issues, for example, nuclear, will have no impact yet on its actual transportation fleet. So those two things have to be, distinguished from one another. Number two, I just want to make the point on the use of oil and this sort of stranglehold is, even if we are 100% independent, quote unquote, although there's no independence, we export our oil, we import oil. So first of all, people should know we use about 20 million barrels of crude a day in the United States. We still import 6 million barrels. Okay, so when we hear we're a net exporter, we're a net exporter of some product, not of crude itself. We're still needing over 4 million barrels a day coming from 23 countries to power our economy. Two, there's a global price. So anything that happens anywhere, as I said before, impacts us and our companies. For example, our companies that are producing these 12 million miraculous barrels, and I don't say that tongue-in-cheek, it's miraculous, many of them are on the verge of bankruptcy, and the coronavirus is going to push them over into bankruptcy.
Really?
So there's over $200 billion of debt. Their refinancing is coming up, and guess what? When oil prices are at $40 due to corona, they're not going to be refinanced. So what happens to us then? So I think just as we didn't think we had oil in 2004, and imports are going up, and production is going down. Like, we just don't know. I always say, don't
Should
bet
the
on.
government step in on those?
No, I just say, we should just not bet our future on one fuel source. That's what my whole point. And then the last thing I'll say about that fuel source is, it funds a lot of people who don't like us very much, or don't share our values. So Russia, for example, you brought up, most 50% of their budget comes from oil revenue, not from natural gas. Natural gas is their lever on Europe. Turn it on, turn it off, but actually the oil is more about money for the government budget. So to me, there's really no reason we should not want to turn oil into a commodity, like every other commodity that has less strategic value. I think that would help us in many of the things we do. As I like to say now, Donald Trump is loath to send troops around the world. He wants to pull them all back. And where's the one place we're sending more troops? Saudi Arabia, 18,000. Are we sending them to South Korea? No, it's because North Korea is like Iran without the oil. It's a dynamic in the global mobile economy. And I think that's really important. So how can we help our allies, to get to the question? Didn't mean to filibuster
Not at all.
with all these facts.
It's fascinating, please.
I think that we lifted our export ban. I think natural gas in particular is a great opportunity to shift around the world. But ultimately, what we really need to be thinking about is, how do we maintain our lead in the innovation of tomorrow, and that is connected, autonomous, shared, and electric vehicles. Because right now, we do not, as a country, really have a plan. Most of our rare earth minerals, most of our lithium, most of our cobalt, some of it's not here, right? It's just not here, but some of it's here. We just don't have a plan. So what I say is, we need a plan from minerals to markets. And that, to me, is really important, because the industrial base of the United States, the industrial base of almost every Western economy, has always been driven by its car industry, right? So here, Ford, then GM. In Europe, Fiat in Italy. In Germany, you've got the Volkswagen Beetle was coming out as they were coming out of the war. And these are in Japan, Toyota. And these are massively important things that lead to innovation. And if China is out there with their Plan 2025 that's totally focused on autonomy, on artificial intelligence, and on electric vehicles, and if that's the next wave, that is going to be our problem. We will go from dependence on this one commodity to dependence on batteries and other technologies. So to me, we should let energy be free. Great. We should export it, et cetera, et cetera. We should diversify where we can and encourage our allies to diversify, so they're not holding on one fuel or fuel source. And then finally, we need to make sure that we are in the lead when it comes to the next wave of energy, whether it be on the utility side, which could be small nukes, could be other things, battery storage clearly, but then also on the car side, because that will be a disaster for maintaining our status in the world.
Well, some things that are related in terms of commodities are not so easy to diversify. You mentioned rare earth elements, for example, and overwhelmingly China is the lead producer. And whenever the U.S. has tried to develop its scarce sources of that, it's kind of foundered in some sense. Some would argue because we haven't had the same kind of, industrial planning that the Chinese have. Is that something that we need to think about in these various areas for these various commodities?
I'd say absolutely. I mean, one of the things, whatever you believe about the Donald Trump presidency, that I think is really interesting is that I don't think industrial policy, especially when thinking about the great power conflict that could be coming with China, is something that Republicans are not willing to consider, things where we need to jump in. And I think that this is one of those areas, and I think that's really important at this moment, because there's really not a free market for many of these. So first of all, I'll quote Mr. Livingston from the Atlantic Council. He once said that cobalt, so that 50% of the cobalt in the world is in the Democratic Republic of Congo. That's an act of God. That 80% of it is actually processed in China. That's an act of government. And I think that that says a lot. And rare earth minerals in particular, I would just say, are misnamed. They sound very rare. They're actually quite abundant. they just are found in if you pick up a lot of dirt, there's a lot of rare earth minerals in there, they're just hard to process. So, China has been, willing to subsidize that, very low environmental regulations, it's a total disaster environmentally.
No OSHA over in China.
Yeah, so I think, look, we have the second largest lithium, non-brine lithium mine in the world, deposit in the world in North Carolina, massive deposits of aluminum. GM announced yesterday they want to get the cobalt out of their battery and only use aluminum. That's, in the United States. Graphite up in Alaska is enough to power us forever, but we don't really have our mining policy is sort of very coal focused. And I think we should be doing more and be thinking about it. And whether it be, from a rare earth mineral perspective, and it's also important for military applications, right? When you think of like these magnets, we use in all our applications, everything. It's just so important. So yeah, if the government maybe has to think about like building a processing facility that all the owners bring in, because not one of them will be able to do it. Like maybe that's what we have to do. We have to look at these policies. But as I say, it's from minerals to markets. And the other thing there, though, is you have Republicans who keep talking about rare earth minerals and mining, but we're not going to do that if we don't have the market here, right? And if we don't have the electric vehicle, the battery storage market, they're just going to do that in another place. For example, the Ford Transit Connect, one of the great vehicles that every utility plumber in the world uses. The electric version is built in Europe and only used in Europe, and I think it was yesterday or the day before that Ford announced that by 2022 they're going to build them here. Well, why would you process the rare earth minerals here? Why would you do any of that if you're not going to build the battery here? So we have to think about it from the minerals to the processing to the battery industry to the vehicles themselves. Just one scary statistic is that there are 70 gigawatt factories being planned in the world, and right now only 5 in the United States. So that just says we are not where they think the action is going to be, and we have to make ourselves more like that. So Republicans have to I think about the market side and how do you make sure that market is here first, and then the Democrats have to think about how do you actually build these things and it doesn't come out of thin air, and you got to think about the mining and the processing and the industrial battery industry, etc.
Well, it would be difficult, though, to do those things and be competitive against countries like China, to which you alluded, which basically have few, if any, restrictions that complicate and make much more expensive processing. I mean, if you don't have any environmental concerns, archaeological concerns, workers' health concerns, you can do a lot more easily and cheaply. And that's been a problem with rare earth elements, hasn't it? Because you've talked about making it viable, but when you're faced with a government that would ignore things that we would think important and probably heavily subsidize production in any event, how can a company remain competitive or even become competitive?
Right. I mean, so that's a complicated question. On June 3rd, we're putting out a big report on that. So
I'll look forward to it.
June 3rd. Coronavirus will be gone and everyone will show up. It'll be amazing.
For Micah, yes.
So we put a clause in our venue. The coronavirus clause.
Oh my God.
So, I would say that, look, first of all, we have to stop the bleeding, so to speak. So there are things like we can do, and I'll just give one very small example. Like in the National Defense Authorization Act just passed in the end of the year, there's a provision that our transit authorities will not give money to Chinese-owned, transit builders, bus builders, and the question there is why should we be in some ways double subsidized? They're subsidizing to underbid our companies,
Sure.
or Western companies, and then we come in and we will give them more money. So there are just things which we should do, and I think have a more, to me, pro West, but whether pro America, component. But two is, look, there are a lot of things we can do. I mean, I don't think we need to be, we can compete as long as we can find ways to make it so that they can't and manipulate the system. So like one thing is transparency. Let's use that as an example. So when the less transparent a mineral market is, the worse the United States is, because we're not gonna, we're not supposed to be bribing officials. That's against our law. So when you go to Africa and the lithium market is completely opaque, or Chile or Bolivia, or you have the cobalt market, I think those are problems. So we should be thinking about anything that increases transparency, increases the free market. I think we as a country are able, both due to our economic might and our tenacity, will compete. And I think there's things like that across the spectrum. So I'm not worried that we can't. I'm worried that we won't, or it'll be too late, because once these things get set, it's very hard to undo some of those things.
Do we need a new mechanism of government? Is the government the answer? Do we need some blue ribbon panel, council, czar? Remember we had an energy czar once upon a time? Is there any, what's the way to move the football down the field on these things?
Yeah, look, I don't, these are massive government questions that I'm not going to get into. But look, I think the free market competes well. I think we just do need to have a sort of a plan out there allowing the free market to compete fairly, and I don't think in the current situation we have that. Do we need a czar? No, I think for the most part we have to make sure that people keep their eye on the ball, and we need a comprehensive plan, right? That's the other thing. It's like very piecemeal now at the moment on some of these things, right? You have like battery storage, and that's all they care about, and it's like energy, but it's more than that. It's about manufacturing. It's about these things. So, to me, I think, first of all, people don't understand, so you have to educate them. And secondly, I think things can happen, especially if this country moves very quickly when we realize we're in a hole. And you got to point that out. And I don't think these are, this is not mobilizing at the scale of World War II. It just means, though, that we need to have a supportive environment. On the positive front, let's take autonomous vehicles, self-driving cars. Clearly, once again, I think culturally, due to our culture, due to our innovative, less hierarchical, business structures, everything else, we're like leading. Now, what should we do? Well, we should allow ourselves to lead, to get out of the way, start changing the regulatory environment. Like, I'm not concerned. When I started this in 2004, I could never have solved the problem. I'm actually more excited we'll solve this problem and many other societal problems from where we stand. We just, as I say, have to take it seriously, think comprehensively, and move forward, as opposed to get into these ideological fights. Because Barack Obama sat in a Chevy Volt, it's forever a climate vehicle and no one should believe in it. Versus an autonomous vehicle, because some airplane doesn't work, suddenly that's our problem. I just think like we just gotta get more serious and grow up a little bit.
Well, do you have any specific policy prescriptions for moving this beyond our borders and enlisting friends and allies and close commercial partners in a broader, more comprehensive effort? Because we have some complementarities that might be helpful in this regard. I'm thinking, of course, EU, Britain, Japan, elsewhere. How would you suggest we proceed? Or should we just focus on, America first kind of approach?
I think it is true that we should work with our allies. I think, as I said before, the entire industrial base of the Western world is premised on this auto industry, this massive industry. And I don't think one country totally overtaking all the other countries is in our best interest. It all causes a lot of instability amongst our allies. So I don't have a problem of figuring that out together. But at the same time, I do believe that we want to stay on the cutting edge, so we should be careful. And there are some things we just don't do here, like batteries. Like, we do invent a lot of batteries, but then somehow they all go to Korea. Now they're going to China. and other places. So like, GM just announced its new facility in Lordstown. It's with LG Chem. Like on one hand, I think it's great. On the other hand, we've had companies like A123, other battery companies, and they haven't had the support that other countries have provided in order for them to survive. So I think it's not a complete domination, but it's also not a complete capitulation to the idea that we don't want whole parts of this entire supply chain, which is an entirely new, sort of new piece of this mobility chain that we sort of head on.
Well, that's very insightful as to the international cooperation and its limits for with our friends. But we've in this conversation referred to China several times. Where does China fit into this picture? Competitor, rival, is there any area for cooperation, or are they just trying to eat our lunch and dinner and breakfast?
I tend to, I think I used to be on one extreme, and I've sort of moved, further over to the, I wouldn't say extreme, but clearly nervous about this. And I think, yes, I think they have long-term plans, and that's a big problem, for us. And for me, and how we want to live our lives, the values that I hold dear of freedom, of privacy, of democracy, those are not things that they share in the same way. And I clearly would like us to be, the global leader, whether you want to say actively promoting those or promoting those through our actions. To me, that's my personal preference, and I believe my organization believes that, it all founded, like, why are we over in the Middle East? Why are we, like, basically kowtowing or dealing, with our values and minimizing our values and dealing with countries that, as I say, don't really share our values, right?
Well, more specifically, though, on the energy front. Oh, go ahead.
So I just want to say, like, I don't want them to own, this industry. I wanted to use one example of batteries, because this is the topic. So I think about that, and I think there's a battery company called Cattle, C-A-T-L, which is now the largest battery company in the world when it comes to electric vehicles. And there's a story in the Wall Street Journal that basically laid out, and the Chinese government said, if you want to sell cars here, you're going to work with a domestic company. And we've heard that story before. Yeah. And the Daimler executives show up there. This is like in the Wall Street Journal. Very specific on these Daimler executives, and they start laying out for them all the technologies. Cattle is showing, like, oh, here's what we could do for you, and they're like way behind technologically. And the Daimler executives said, we don't care what you do, just tell us the price, because we have to do this. And so what happens? They start building this company because they're being forced to build this company. And then they're like, well, you know what? Maybe we'll lay down the story, put our research dollars into LG Chem or Panasonic anymore, because I got to go with this company anyways. Now, of course, it's the biggest and the most technologically advanced company. Those are self-inflicted wounds that we should not be doing. So I do believe that there's a rivalry, and I would like to have a fair, free competition, and hopefully win.
Well, China continues, as I understand, to crank out coal-burning plants.
Mm-hmm.
Is that the wave of the future in China? What should we do about it, if anything?
So we're not a climate group, so we tend not to engage in that as an organization. I'm happy to share with you my thoughts. First of all, I don't know if people haven't seen this. There was a map on CNN.com that showed basically Wuhan pre-corona and post-corona, and the amount of emissions that were coming out of there. It is the most incredible thing you have ever seen. Just the change, but just how much has changed.
So is coronavirus the answer to our environmental problems?
Well, I was going to basically say, going into the dark ages. Look, I tend to believe that China has massive. We do make it out to be this big boogeyman out there, but the truth is they have massive internal problems themselves.
Indeed.
And I think they're going to continue to do what they need to do in order to keep their society stable. And whether they can keep that, I can't tell you. I'm not a China expert. So my view on that is, I wouldn't just look to them and say, because they've promised us this, part of the Paris Accords, or because they've promised to do this or that, we should just, just take it on their word, like, oh, China's going to solve this problem. I do point out that there is a company from a very rule of law country who cheated another rule of law country in cars. That would be VW, which basically, if a German company can cheat in the United States and actually around the world, I don't think we really know what's going on over there. So my view is they're just going to do what they got to do, and we need to do what we need to do, and we shouldn't. I think they'll burn coal as they need to keep stability, and then they're gonna. But also, look, their cities are smog, and it's very dirty over there, and so one of the reasons they just have so much energy they need, that they're the fastest renewable markets and everything else. They're just because they have their own pollution problems. Look, our rivers had to go on fire before we cared. They have that problem too. So
we've been goading them a little bit on that.
Yeah.
They have an index that they announce each day of, how good or bad air quality is, and but they have a ceiling on it. It's a fairly low ceiling, so it only goes up to that maximum. Although in reality, air quality is much worse sometimes. So the U.S. Embassy has some external display where they show the actual rate, so the Chinese walking by can see or make a point of going over and taking a look. The Chinese government reportedly hates that for obvious reasons.
Yeah.
We're trying to point out, the disparities here. But more broadly on coal, maybe would you mind telling us a bit? I know you've talked about diversity being important on energy. So what's your feeling about coal and the future of coal?
Yeah, I think the coal has actually not such a promising future in the electricity sector. It has a lot to do with natural gas prices than it does with everything else. Yes, there are a lot of regulatory things that have given it challenges, but ultimately natural gas prices are incredibly cheap, and for baseload power it is cheaper to just burn natural gas due to fracking, and that's the market working. And now you see cheaper and cheaper renewables, especially paired with storage. So we are going through this transition, and it will continue. And unfortunately, depending how you look at it, coal is for market reasons just there's no saving. There's no saving that. I think the economic writing is on the wall. The investor sentiment, due to where investors want to put their money, or younger people, or a variety, what they call the ESG. I just think it's a big problem, and I actually think other forms of fuel are going to face that. Now, we're not talking about tomorrow; we're talking over decades, but it's not forever.
Well, how about the nuclear industry? Japan has been really trying to find its path since 3/11, for example, and realizing that it's one thing to say nuclear power is bad because it was a disaster at 3/11, but how do you deal with replacing it in a reasonable way? Do you just burn a lot of coal? Do you pay exorbitant prices for things? Other than that, other sources? I mean, and nuclear power in this country, it's not like we're cranking out nuclear power plants by the dozen, are we?
We can't build the couple we've allowed.
Well, there you go. So
we've driven that companies bankrupt due to that.
What's the future of nuclear power? What should
Look,
it be?
I'm not a nuclear expert, so I guess I know I know a little bit of a lot of things, but not. I'm a hedgehog. I'd say that my sense of nuclear is we're going to use it. If you believe that climate change is an issue, clearly it's a massive amount of power. At the same with carbon free, but clearly the small modular nuclear reactors is probably somewhere where we as a country once again want to be leading, not following, and we should I guess accept that we're not going to build massive nuclear power plants anymore, that we're just incapable of that, and the next wave of this technology are these smaller modular reactors, and we should be supporting that in any way we can to sort of be the leading country on that. And Bill Gates and others have made big investments in that. We just need to continue to support that and try to deploy those.
Any topics we haven't touched on that you'd like to address before I turn to our audience and ask if they have some questions for you? You've been very nice about this interrogation, by the way.
Oh, no problem. You never met my family. This is pleasant.
Oh, very nice.
Basically, I guess my thoughts are, we have this view that we're Saudi America and that there's no longer a problem. And I think it is still a tremendous problem because we have a global market. And we might have more flexibility in some of the decisions we can make, like, going and killing Soleimani or whatever it might be. But at the same time, oil makes the world go round, and in a global mobile economy, you need it. Now, what this coronavirus shows you is actually how mobile and how global our economy really is, that we can't get parts, we can't get all these things because of built in China, or now people won't travel. It's massively important where we are. And therefore, as the country, if we want to maintain our status, we should have the most flexibility we have in foreign policy, or the least economic dependence on this one commodity. So I don't feel our mission has changed, although I do believe the rhetoric, and many people have convinced that it's changed because of low prices, but things change very quickly in our world. You never know what's coming around the corner. And so we are on the cutting edge of the most amazing convergence of technologies and transportations that have not happened in 100 years. It's the convergence of batteries, the convergence of sensors, of big data. And when you bring those things together, and as I said, you get this connected, autonomous, shared, and ultimately electric future, you begin to solve this problem. And you don't just solve it from a security perspective. There's an environmental component. There's also saving 37,000 lives on our roads every year, 3,000 lives a day in the world. Think of that. You begin to provide mobility to people that have not gotten it before, who have been quarantined for a lot of their lives, the disadvantaged, the disabled, and more the elderly. And if we can get them to places that they can no longer go. And then finally, when you think about the future of economic productivity has not really grown in the Western world over the last decades. But as you shrink distance, because you're shrinking because of autonomy, I think you begin to see that creative destruction here. So to me, this is how we have basically organized our societies over the last 100 years. Car ownership, single car ownership, and that's all changing. So we're in for this amazing revolution that has so many upsides, and we should go into that future, bravely, and but better get a hold of it. Don't let it sneak up on us. And I think the United States is well poised to own a lot of it. We just have to, as I say, take it a little more seriously and have a comprehensive plan, moving forward.
Terrific. Well, I would like to turn to our audience now and ask. We have a few questions that people might want to ask. I see a distinguished gentleman here who might want to ask the first question. If you could start by telling us who you are and your affiliation. I know it very well, but.
Chip Gregson, retired Marine, former government official. When are we going to start to see a sufficient number of charging stations on the highway system?
So first of all, there are about 80,000 charging stations in the country. If you've driven an electric car all over, as you're driving, you do see them. I guess they're very invisible to people who, if you don't have an electric car. But I think that we have a few challenges when it comes to charging. So one is, you just got to do it, and maybe that is the role for government to say, every gas station that's on our highways, just as Tesla's put down it, we're going to provide land for whether it be a company like EVgo or some other company to do it. That's number one. Two is, even if we do that, it takes longer currently to fill up an electric car than not. You know, you're spending a little more time the distance. So I'm not here to say to you that tomorrow an electric car will solve all your problems. Now, some people are willing to do that, but 60% of Americans own 2 or more cars. 35% of Americans own 3 or more cars. If we just changed one car that you use not to drive, like tonight I have to drive to North Carolina, like I'm gonna take a different car. I have an electric car too, but just doing that will just fundamentally alter the entire world. So I think just focusing on like these long trips, the few trips, so many Americans could change their habit just by changing one of their commuter car, their daily car. So I think that's really important. But 2 is, I do think there are a lot of stations. I do think we're getting there. And then the next thing to think about is the amount of power that these are going to need as we change our fleets. So, you know, a lot of you see bus metro systems are getting, 3 or 5 or 10 or even like 20. That's not a big deal. But when you have a 500 pull up into a depot and suddenly you're bringing all that power to them, that's a fundamental change. In some ways, that's a great economic opportunity, right? Do we bring the power to the vehicles, or do we bring the vehicles to the power, start building our depots closer to the substations, or whatever it may be? So I actually think that as the vehicles come out, that's then going to become the next hurdle. And unfortunately, our utilities don't move all the time with the incredible speed. So there's going to be this sort of timing challenge between changing the heavy-duty fleet and the amount of power they need and the amount of time it gets to get the power. So once again, like, I don't think most of this is not about invention, right? We're kind of on that invention curve. A lot of this is like putting a shovel in the ground and figuring out where it's got to go, put the first generation, and then we'll get to the second generation and the third generation. This is about a little bit more about the way. Like, one reason we like electric vehicles as an organization is what we like to say is there's only 2 national infrastructures in the United States. The only 2 national infrastructures are electricity and gasoline. And so it does exist everywhere, but yes, we have to upgrade, we've got to add more capacity, but at the end of the day, that is all doable.
It's a great question. Can anyone top that, or? Please.
Thank you, sir, for your nice presentation about this issue. This topic is very
Oh, sir, would you
interesting.
mind totally
I'm Fonseca.
introducing yourself?
I'm Fonseca Pereira from DCM, the Timor-Leste Embassy in Washington, D.C.
Okay.
Thank you. This topic is very interesting to me because it's known that a small country, Timor-Leste, is far away from USA, located in Southeast Asia region, and the major income or revenue of the country is oil and gas. But currently we are also facing a situation that in the position whether we proceed or develop the oil and gas, but actually we Timor-Leste sustain its development by using the revenue oil and gas, 90% of the country. And now we are trying to diversify this product into other areas like tourism and other agriculture, that we want to diversify into that. And my question just wondering about the best practice of USA, how USA diversify the oil and gas, because I believe that using this revenue, oil and gas, I can say that it's not permanent.
Right.
One day it will end, and depend on the source. So the economic challenge. This is also a challenge for such as Timor-Leste. It's a new developing country. Challenge, and other view also mentioned that advise Timor-Leste to whether better you reserve your oil and gas, you explore other sources as well. So I'm very keen to know your best practice and your policy to develop the oil and gas and also other sectors
Yeah.
for the country. Thank you.
Thank you. I would say, so first of all, it's called an oil curse because the countries that have it and depend on it for their revenue are, they tend to have, less democracy, less interactions with other international organizations, slightly less healthy civil societies. And so there's a lot of studies on that. So I think it's a challenge, like we're dependent, but so are the countries that sell it are dependent. And it's this sort of mutual relationship between us. We actually did an energy oil index, a security index, and actually the least dependent was Japan, despite having no oil, because they had a lot of very efficient use of oil in their economy, and they had a lot of above ground stock to deal with short-term problems and a few other things. Where the most dependent were actually Saudi Arabia and Russia, because their entire economy was so dependent on this. And if you look at Saudi's plan, we talked about China 2025, like why does the Crown Prince say that he wants to do all this? I mean, he's thinking over time his revenue base could be falling, and therefore we need another economic outlet. So I think that thinking like that is precisely true. I will quote a movie that was before my time, but very famous, called The Graduate. I don't know if you've seen The Graduate, but when he turns to Dustin Hoffman, and he says, "Think plastics." I would say, think Norway. That's my advice. Look, Norway is an incredible, smart country. They have the wealthiest sovereign wealth fund in the world. And what do they get that money from? They get it from selling oil and fossil fuels. And yet, they have the #1 market for electric vehicles in the world. 50% of their sales are now electric. So what they're saying to themselves is, first of all, they're thinking, okay, we're not going to use our oil and gas ourselves. We're going to use our hydro, power our economy, and we're going to take that money by selling it to everyone else. And then use that money to invest in the future. So I think that oil and gas countries are, and if I were Texas, I would think the same thing. I want to use less of it for myself. I want to export more of it to the other states of the United States, to the other parts of the world. And then I want to take that money, that inflow of cash, and start investing, in the future. And I just think if you have to be serious about that and start doing that now, and there's hope. But I think ultimately it is you've been given it's a dying hand at this point going forward. It's been a great windfall until this point, but I do think it's really time to take all that windfall and start in building economy, diverse economy for the future.
Thank you. Any other questions over here? Or you can follow up, please.
Just the last sentence. So oil and gas is not best investment for the future of the country.
Yeah, I think if you're thinking decades, right? I think these are questions that world leaders have to be thinking through the decades. I think for the decades, it's not. I would use whatever I have, right? I mean, I'm saying don't leave it in the ground. Don't do those things. I'm just saying take the money from those and know that this is not going to be there forever as my windfall, and therefore I have to start using that money now to diversify my economy or invest in other types of businesses.
Thank you.
Please.
My name is Bonner Cohen. I'm with a company called Jewel X, and I'm also handle energy for several nonprofits here in Washington. I'm very intrigued by your idea of minerals to markets, which presupposes, as you pointed out, that the market has to be there, or have to have a certain size. Otherwise, it makes precious little sense to try to mine the minerals, be they rare earths or whatever. And you mentioned aluminum in North Carolina just as an example of something that's out there and could play a role in our energy future. I'm thinking here about Appalachia, which I think we would all agree with this, is not going to be in the future the Appalachia that it has been even in the recent past because of the decline of coal, which is probably irreversible. So do you see our extraction of rare earths and other minerals, provided, of course, we have a domestic, not only a domestic market for them, but also process facilities for them, which with respect to rare earths we do not have. Do you see this as a key to the revitalization of places like Appalachia, which have been so dependent on one thing for so long, and that is now coming to an end, that this could be point a way to a different, a better, new and better future for them?
So I'm not an expert in Appalachia, so I can't tell you where all the minerals are. I mean, I know that, like for example, natural gas, they've looked to build the chemical facilities there and other value-added types of industries. And so I think, look, not speaking specifically to Appalachia, I do believe there are a lot of parts of this country that don't feel invested or don't care as much about the climate question, right? If that's, like, if I were a Democrat now and I'm saying, okay, like half the country, that's not really what they're thinking about. Now there's a generational divide between the ideologies and everything else, but let's just say, but they actually have all the parts to help mobilize the future to solve a lot of the climate issues. And so to me, it shouldn't be seen as like dirty industry versus or old versus new. It's actually, you have the component parts to get what many of these Democrats want. And so it's convincing the Democrats that things aren't, made in recycling plants everywhere. You actually have to produce something from scratch. Better to do it in the country. Keep your balance of payments here. And at the same time, that Republicans need to understand that actually providing support for those industries as they're growing is a sort of a critical component. And I think there's a deal to be had there. I mean, so SAFE is in the business, as we said. How do you solve it? You produce what you can, use it as efficiently as possible, and you diversify. So we've been on both sides, and I'm always looking for where do you go, and I think at the moment that is what you need to do. And there's a political interest for Democrats. They want to win back the presidency and others. So I think that there's a clean energy future. Generally, it's talked about as like, look how many jobs we've gotten to build windmills, turbines. Look how many jobs we have to put solar on our roofs. All that's true. But there's also, if you go up the supply chain, an incredible energy future that then feeds into a lot of countries that were our manufacturing base or our resource base before that can now, be that again. So I just think like we let ideology and messaging get in the way of what could be a much more national consensus. Hope that was helpful. I realized I didn't really get into Appalachia, so.
Oh, yeah, well, and it's not just Appalachia. I think of the Iron Range in northern Minnesota, for example, where they're not overly concerned about global warming, but there are a tremendous amount of resources there, and as you pointed out, there's a huge political fight there, pitting the environmental left against actually old-style blue-collar Democratic voters, the miners who would actually extract that, and that has to sort itself out. And those are the kinds of conflicts that will continue to go on, because frankly, getting back to the environmentalists, they don't like any kind of mining, unless, of course, it's for wind turbines and what have you, and a lot of that mining is out of sight, out of mind, because it's over in Africa and elsewhere. No, as I said, you correctly pointed out, it's going to take a lot of, if this is going to happen, it's going to take a lot of rethinking on the part of a lot of people.
Care to respond?
The man deserves a Nobel Prize in economics for genius. I agree with that. Everything about that.
Since we're running up against time, maybe we could end it there. I'd entertain one more question if somebody insists. If not, let me thank Robbie very much and his crack team for coming out here today and braving the virus and whatever other perils, real or imagined, that we're facing today. And we look forward to continuing the conversation.
Thank you so much for hosting me, and look forward to working together.
Same. Thank you.
Who's got Purell? Just
It's very nice to meet you. We spoke about
Yes,
a
I
few
know,
days ago.
I
It's like-
realized when you said Jewel.
So we'll be getting
Good, thanks for letting me draft you. That wasn't too much.
I hope this is good.
Oh, yeah, yeah, very happy. It's a shame. It's such a small crowd.
Oh, I was at LaGuardia yesterday.
Nice to see you.
Oh,
It was
really?
like totally empty.
Oh,
Totally empty.
Oh, my God. So- That's fine.
Someone just sent me a picture of Ben Gurion afterwards, like there's like 2 people in it.
Good job.
Thank you very much.
Thanks for
Oh, I don't know.
I got all your contact info. How's it going? Good, good. I'm actually staying at a hotel right across the street.
Oh yeah, we got that new hotel.
Yeah.
I heard it's great.
It's nice. I stayed in those in Europe.
Nice to see you too. Thank you for coming.
How's I don't know, how's life?
Good, good. Looks like you have a question. You can.
You're very well.
Yeah, no problem.
I have it for, Michael McIntyre, he's giving us a presentation.
Thank you very much. Ready? Yeah, I can do the help.
Yeah, I know. Don't think I've seen you in the building. I don't know.
I was just there last week.
Oh,
Talking about grid security with Bruce Walker.
Okay, awesome.
What do you do over here?
I'm the senior policy manager.
And you know, someone from our shop is doing your ledge office, Chuck Cunningham.
Oh, really?
Starting Monday, I think.
Oh, that's awesome. Of course, of course.
You're welcome anytime.
Are you a political
I
appointee
didn't
or
take any offensive, but I was just very happy to see you.
Very good. Well, anything you need, happy to share our insights or lack thereof.
Professor, we spoke on the phone.
All right.
Michael McIntyre, good to
Thank
see
you.
you.
Thank you very much.
This is a good event.
I hope that was helpful.
Yeah, it's gonna.
You can write a memo saying, sure, you have my card? Sure. Happy to.
No, I mean, every place in here, we've been distributing twice.
Oh my gosh, what do you do?
I saw
That'll cost you money.
Oh my gosh, 4 and 9, different windows. This is an interesting event. Do you do more energy stuff?
We'd like to do more energy stuff, but we don't have the energy to come see us.
Oh, boy.
Oh, no, you gotta take it with our star here.
Yes. Well, the AC warm, sounds great too.
It's my first visit here.
I'm saying that you have a great
Thank you.
And back to DOE.
Well, I'll look forward to an email.
Told you I was coming. I came.
Is that okay? Is your picture okay?
Yes, experience.
Great, thank
You had a
you.
chance to talk to Rob?
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Professor.
Most excellent, sir.
Thank you very much, hope that was interesting.
I had a lot of fun. I wish we had some people that keep saying that, but hopefully next time we do one of these things, people
Right.
feel more reassured.
Right.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you very much.
I,
Good to
Thank
meet you.
you.
at some point in the near future, I might go back
Thank
to
you. Great
our
question.
founders, because I have a project idea for, basically I just met with the co-founder.
Yeah, to be for an event.
And what we were talking about is, you know, I know they're very free market, oriented, and really the problem in the country is that we have these regulations that have been defined over 100 years in transportation that have not been allowing innovation and are using the regulatory structure to impede our future. So for example, SAFE, just wrote, last year wrote, comments to the DOT on Neuro, which is a delivery vehicle company, where we basically supported them taking out their steering wheel and their brakes and their windshield and their, because if they can build from scratch, that would allow them to rethink design from scratch. And DOT just put out using our legal brief
Wow.
and using our legal reasoning to allow them to do that.
Pretty awesome.
Yeah, it was quoted like 11 times.
Did you write all that?
No, that was not the project transfer.
So we just see that constantly, and so we're talking to the Charles Koch Standing Together, it's called, and actually I was with Eric Schmidt, Google also.
Great, yes.
So I was like,
Alphabet now.
yeah. So I was like, look, the problem is that innovation is coming, but we have a very constrained environment, and we have to rethink the rules from scratch. And we need an organization and an effort, especially on the safety side, that's redefining what that is, or else we'll never move forward. Because you have all these Ralph Nader, educated, supported people, and they really own that community. And every politician like calls them up and says, like, oh, you know, what do you think of this? And to me, I care about security, and then you care about this, this entrepreneurial question. You need to rethink how people get around and what they do, and that requires innovation. But then the holdup is always these, antiquated 40, 50, 60-year-old rules.
Well, as you decide to make a pitch, I'd be very happy to weigh in a positive way.
I first have to
Say,
say,
you guys are a family and this is a partner organization. So if you send me like a short note kind of describing and saying, oh, thinking of doing this.
Yeah, sure.
Then I can forward it
Perfect.
to Abby, and
I
at least it will give you a little bit of a heads up.
Yeah. Look, we don't know her. I've never met her, but we're talking like her of Southwest, passed away, and we're gonna his family. We're gonna sort of also pitch them on that idea, which is like there would have never been a Southwest if they let the incumbents. They hadn't deregulated the airline industry.
Good point, yeah.
And so we think, sort of in his memory, or sort of using his name, this idea of, look, what we want to be able to do is provide innovation, both business innovation, but also product innovation in the hands of consumers. And this is like a big holdup in this, in these areas. So we want to. It's probably in the next month, 6 weeks, I'll have a better idea what we want to do and
Cool.
share it with you.
Look forward to hearing from you.
Perfect. Okay, well, good luck.
Buddy.
Good luck braving the storm, the pandemic.
Yes, right.
It sounds a little scary when you call it a
I have
pandemic.
lots of friends in,
Continue
sure, I have lots of friends in Seattle though, and they're all
I'm
working.
shaking lots of hands.
Pleasure.
Yeah.
They're all
I don't want to
working
touch my
from home.
eyes, okay?
Don't.
It's a bicycle.
Don't. I'm happy to share with you, like, some of the problems, sure.
Oh, is that?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Is that what that is?
I clapped my hands and I thought, oh.
Is it, here, put it in the back of my hand, please.
So say, I've
I
got.
should expense this.
You should.
I bought it during my
You
travels.
I have
Do you want any more
mine
of
is a Daniel Morgan.
Ah,
They won't give them out, that was a mosquito.
Oh, really? I was gonna
You can check
ask.
these kits.
You should give it, you should give it to me as a speaker, a present.
You want?
We're giving you Purell as a present.
Speaker,
You want
a
mine?
speaker
You can
guy?
have it. No, it's okay, I don't want.
Sorry,
to-
mine, I got a big one, I just bought it in Indianapolis 2 days ago, so.
I'm telling you, it's like, I hope this doesn't change life forever, it's really.
I don't think. I think it will. I disagree with the president's view of like it's just gonna poof go away. But I think over time we'll both learn to live with it, and also we'll get a vaccine. But it'll just take time, and then also the number, will go down. It'll just become probably part of the flu type of thoughts. It's also not the flu. Everyone calls it the flu. I just got the email today. It's like not a flu. It's different. It's part of COVID-19. It's a different type of disease. But it's symptoms.
People don't understand it, and so they're afraid.
Yeah, we don't deal with fear very well in this society.
We don't at all.
No, we
It's not just us, Like I said, I'm planning to fly to Japan in July with my family. My nephew's getting married, and United is like, well, we're canceling a lot of flights. I've got reservations, but they
Right.
may get back to me and cancel the flights. They're issuing waivers for a number of flights that are short-term to Japan, meaning if you decide to cancel, they won't charge you any money. And hint, hint, they're encouraging you to, because they can, get rid of a few flights that way.
Right.
I mean,
Yeah, I just had
So if
a,
they don't have a full or half-size load, then it's not, and they lose money on the flight.
that's it.
Yeah.
So just,
Because the price of their fuel.
well, and there
Outweighs.
you go. But I was also watching NHK Japanese news last night, and they have like a couple dozen countries that are refusing to allow anyone to travel there from Japan for fear of this virus.
Interesting.
It's including like India, so it's not just like, you know, the
Right.
Virgin Islands is one of them, but I mean, you know,
Mhm.
various places are not letting Japanese travel anyplace.
Interesting. That is interesting.
Travel, man, I don't know, just saying.
Yeah.
Anyways, okay guys,
Okay.
let's be off, I
Coming
gotta get
back.
to North Carolina, so.
All right, I'm
Okay.
gonna take you to the elevator.
Thank you, this was
Thank you
great,
very much.
great questions.
Well, it was a great conversation, and it was streamed, so.
Don't, keep on his toes.
Yeah.
Our fellow famous.
She is, actually.
That's great.
Yeah.
On our off time.
We think we're happy with her. Think we're happy with her.
Yeah, she's great. Thank you.
Thank you. What, oh, my God. Like Lincoln's flag?
No, George Washington, it's just an American
Like,
flag.
more secure.
Older.
Yeah.
Can't say it's the end of it. All right, take care.
We'll try to get a copy and walk it. I think the school should maybe go away. Like that.
Take care.
Thank you very much.
We are not taking any chances. No chances whatsoever.
Oh my God, he was.
Oh yeah.
That's my fault.
We are getting everything.
That's
and
my fault. That's right. That's right.
We're getting everything.
That's right. We don't need
We're
none.
not getting this here.
We don't need none of that.
We don't need
None of that.
And
That's right.
Can't forget to spray the door handles.
Spray in here too.
Okay.
Even though. I'm not trying to make you breathe. That was me. You know, we got windows, but at least it's, you know, clean out the air. Word.
Okay, there's that.
I knew you wanted to take home, and I didn't want to.
Take two.
Thank you.
We got plenty, yeah.
Okay.
This
So
is,
you want
this
to
is the
take
Amazon order. Yeah, each of you take one, please.
Okay. Thank you all.
You got it.
important.